Would you all say this with me? Forward together, not one step back. I'm glad to be here with you tonight and to join with you in this celebration of service and ministry by the Greater Birmingham Ministries. I don't know what this cowbell is for unless to make me shut up. But it's really good to be here. Let me honor your chairwoman, Christine Kennedy, and your program chair, Reverend Dolly Howell-Pankney, and also the Banquet Committee chair, the Reverend Lofton Higgs. Let's give them a big hand tonight. Let's give these children a mighty shout. They're in the back. I met them in the back, and they were tremendous in greeting us on today. And let me tell you how much I love Scott Douglas. He is a brother, beloved. I met him at MIT when we were studying together for a couple of years. He's one of the smartest brothers I've ever seen in my life. And I thank God for him. And I'm just glad that he would extend an invitation on your behalf to be here. I'm also glad because you can blame him for everything I say tonight. So sometimes when people invite you places, you wonder a little bit. And let me thank the mic man in advance. I've been moving around a lot. My voice is a little weak. If you keep it up, I'll back off of it because I know how important it is. If people can't see you, at least they can hear you. But there's a story about a man who entered his mule in the Kentucky Derby. And somebody said, "Are you crazy? Why would you put a swayback mule in the Kentucky Derby?" He said, "He won't even be out of the gate, and the thoroughbreds will be around the track." He said, "I know that." He said, "Well, why would you do it? He can't win." He said, "I know that too." "Well, why would you do it?" He says, "Well, I entered him into Kentucky Derby not because he could win, but because I thought the exposure might do him good." So evidently Scott Douglas thought the exposure might do me good. To come down here and be with you at the Greater Birmingham Ministry. Just give Greater Birmingham Ministry a mighty hand of applause. In this time in which we live, I want to suggest something tonight and ask God's help. You know, God takes this strange risk of putting treasure in trash, treasure in an earthen vessel, that the excellency of the power might be of God and not of us. So I'm always amazed and humbled when God allows me to say anything that makes sense and anything that has an impact in helping to push forward the movement for love and justice. Tonight I want to suggest with you, Scott, and others, that moral dissent in this nation right now is the only path to higher ground. There's a scripture in Psalm 94 that says, verse 16, "Who will rise up for me against the evildoers? Or who will stand up for me against the workers of iniquity?" And in this text, what is strange about it is God puts on the lips of the psalmist the question for the ages in a time of political oppression and systemic injustice, in a time when those in power are so drunk with that power that they are using it in ways to hurt the vulnerable. God says, "Who will rise up for me against the evildoers, and who will stand up against the workers of iniquity?" In other words, God predates Howard Thurman's question, where will you stand? On the side of the disinherited or on the side of those who disinherit the disinherited? Now, the strange thing about that question in Psalm 94, when God is basically saying, who will dissent? Who will go against the grain? Who will challenge the popular notions? Who will say something about what is going on? In Psalm 94, it ends kind of sad because it says that if God had not stood up, nobody would have stood. The tragedy about that was that God was looking for his people, and when God was kind of lost in this text, where are my people? And you know, ontologically, whenever God is lost, that's a real problem theologically. when the God who is, who was before was, and is and shall be even after what is and was has passed away, dares to suggest I can't find what I'm looking for. In essence, God says, I know there's some people I delivered out of Egypt. I know there's some people I brought a mighty long ways. I know there are some people that know wrong when they see it. But who will stand up for me? And God says, the text says that everybody would have just gone along to get along. They would have just crawled up and lived in depression because the evildoers had because the workers of iniquity seemed to have all the power. And then God stood up. But I want to suggest that God wants to do more than stand up God's self. God wants his people to stand up. And moral dissent is God's way of saying there's another way, that somebody in every age must stand in contrast, must dissent, must challenge systems of domination, destruction, and injustice. And you know, it's not new. Abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison was once rescued from being lynched by a pro-slavery mob in Boston, of all places. The mayor threw him in jail to save his life because Garrison was so harsh in his criticism of slavery and so harsh in his criticism of those who kept looking the other way. And when they asked him to be moderate, he said, you go tell a woman who's trying to rescue a child from a burning house to be moderate. And when she becomes moderate, then I'll become moderate. But until then. And William Lloyd Garrison was put in jail on October 21st, and he wrote this in his jail cell. He said, today on Wednesday, October 21st, William Lloyd Garrison was put in jail in 1835, saved from an influential mob who sought to destroy him for preaching the abominable and dangerous doctrine that all men are created equal. But he dared to dissent. Henry Thoreau was protesting the war in Mexico. Henry Thoreau refused to pay a poll tax because he couldn't in conscience support an imperialistic government that sought to expand the institution of slavery. He wrote a book essay called On Resistance to Civil Government. And one day Henry Thoreau was in jail, and his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson visited him and said, Henry, what are you doing in jail? To which Thoreau said, the real question is, Ralph, what are you doing out of jail? In light of all this injustice, what are you doing standing on the sideline? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came here in this city so known for Fred Shuttleworth and the great work and the great courage. Reverend Shuttleworth and I were talking today, encouraged Dr. King and come here. And Dr. King, when he was being criticized from ministers in this city, and they were saying he was an outsider, Dr. King said, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. And injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This moral dissenting, it'll bubble up anytime. So the other day, last year, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg became the voice of moral and constitutional dissent. She sounded more like a prophet than a Supreme Court justice when the day the Shelby case was decided. I hope you've read her dissent. And she looked at the Supreme Court that wasn't acting supreme or like a good court. And she said to them, you know what you've done today, hubris, pride, is a fit word for today's demolition of the Voting Rights Act. She went on to say, throwing out the pre-clearance Section 4 formula when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And then she went above the authority of the Supreme Court and she reminded them of Bloody Sunday. This is a justice on the Supreme Court. She said, you may have done this today. This is how she talked to him. You may have done this today, but don't forget Bloody Sunday, and don't forget the fact that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it always bends toward justice. Moral dissenters, people who will cut across the grain, are in good company. People who believe, in spite of whatever, that there's always higher ground. There's a better way. And in this moment in history, I believe, my friends, from North Carolina to Alabama, we're being called again to answer this question: who will rise up for me against those who do wrong? Touch your neighbor and say, who will rise up against those who do wrong? Now, maybe sometimes people are quiet or so cordial in the midst of these times is because they don't understand the urgency of now. So I believe every now and then, like the Sankofa bird in Africa, you got to look back in order to fly forward. Let me for a moment tonight talk about two periods of history in America that I believe help us navigate through the moment we're in and help us understand how urgent it is that somebody answer that question, who? That somebody recognizes that moral dissent is the only hope for this nation to keep going to higher ground. The first period of history we need to look at is the Reconstruction movement, 1868, right after slavery, when whites and blacks and many clergy came together across the South and they formed something called Fusion Coalition. Say Fusion Coalition. And with this power of black and whites coming together in the South, they pushed forward voting rights and educational rights and tax reform and criminal justice and labor rights, and they rewrote constitutions all over the South. In North Carolina, they even made education a constitutional right 146 years ago. They guaranteed African Americans equal treatment, even here in Alabama. They guaranteed it. In fact, by 1875, we had the Civil Rights Act, the first Civil Rights Act, that said that African Americans had to have equal treatment in public accommodations and public transportation, and that black people, men at that time, could serve on juries. This is 1875, first Civil Rights Act, and that it was a felony to discriminate against somebody. The bill was drafted by Senator Charles Sumter, a dominant radical Republican in the Senate, but it was also at the assistance of John Mercer Langston, the prominent African-American who established a law school at Howard University, and it was signed by President Grant. But in less than 4 years, the radical and racist Dixiecrats of this period couldn't stand it. They said all this black-white getting along is too much of a problem. And so around 1870, they started an immoral campaign. And listen to how they framed it. They called it the Redemption Movement. And they said that their goal was to redeem America from the influence of black political and white political power working together. And they launched a frontal attack all over the South. The Tea Party, wrong century, the Redemption Movement. I'll get to this century, but just hold up. The Redemption Movement. 1877, there was a compromise. That's why I don't like compromises. The 1877 compromise. Rutherford B. Hayes lost the popular vote. Remember the Bush scenario? It happened in 1877. He lost the popular vote, but he cut a deal to get the Electoral College, and the deal was he'd pull all the troops out of the South. When he did that, by 1883, those who wanted to go backwards had worked underground to put racist judges on the Supreme Court. And so in 1883, they overturned the Civil Rights Act of 1875. These radical Dixiecrats found a means to deny the vote to blacks through violence, intimidation. They formed a Klan at first not to come after black people, but to go after white people who were working with black people. From 1890 to 1908, 10 southern states wrote new constitutions with provisions that included literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather. In Alabama, you first had the Redeemer's Constitution of 1875. That's the first one they wrote. They eliminated State Board of Education that had been created by the Fusion Constitution in 1868. They segregated the state public schools again and reduced spending for education. They didn't want public education. The Redemption Movement. Deja vu, you know. 1893, they passed the Sauter Act and allowed the Alabama government to appoint election officials and made the voting process difficult, not just for black people, but for poor whites as well. They were willing to hurt white people as long as they could stop black people. Right here in Alabama. And then right in Alabama, they wrote the 1901 Constitution, that one you all are trying to deal with right now. Yeah, you know that Constitution. And it says, and one historian said it was designed, listen, it was a design. Watch people who run for office. They got something they want to do. The Constitution was designed to freeze change in the desirable channels. Not only did the 1901 Constitution restrict suffrage voting, but also did a little to make government more responsible to the challenge of this new century. The 1901 Constitution was more a code of laws to undermine, to deconstruct Reconstruction. They defeated populism through electoral fraud. You want to talk about fraud? Don't talk about voter ID today. Talk about what happened yesterday. That's the real fraud. In the 1890s, they hoped to eliminate black voting. So they decided to follow the lead of Mississippi and South Carolina and Louisiana and North Carolina that had already rewritten their constitution. May 21st, they called this convention a symbol, and they make John B. Knox the president on 22nd. And in his opening speech, Knox declared to the delegates that federally imposed Reconstruction had forced them into action, that the convention had been called to disenfranchise blacks without disenfranchising any whites, which would be achieved by enshrining white supremacy legally in a constitution and therefore eliminating the need for fraud. This is what he said. He said, in other words, we're going to write laws to deny black people their right to vote because we can't win an election if they vote. The only way we can win if black people and progressive whites are voting together is cheating. But if we cheat and write a constitution that doesn't allow them to vote, then we don't have to have fraud at the ballot box. That's what they actually said. Now understand this. I want you to hear this. The strategy in this country to stop any Reconstruction and any fusion politics, to stop rooms like this from not just gathering at the banquet, but gathering at the ballot box, has always consisted of 5 actions. If you want to stop America from going forward or going to higher ground: attack voting rights, attack fair tax policies that allows the government to have enough money to engage in programs of social uplift, attack public education, attack labor rights, and attack or assassinate white and black progressive leaders. And by 1902, Reconstruction was dead. Then we get to the second Reconstruction. Brown versus Board of Education is kind of the signal. 1954, 9 whites on the Supreme Court, 1 former Ku Klux Klan member. Justice Warren, who had been horrendous when it came to Chinese immigrants, and nobody thought he would certainly be the one to lead the court down this. But then Thurgood Marshall, following the lead of all the people before him, like Charles Hamilton Houston, had built that case. And we won, 9-0. 1954. Then in 1955, you get the Montgomery bus boycott. You get that after Emmett Till was killed in 55. Rosa Parks says when she saw the picture of Emmett Till laying in that casket and his mama keeping the casket open, it was then that she decided she had to sit down that others might stand up. And you get the beginning of the second Reconstruction right here in Alabama. Fusion politics. 1954-68, blacks and whites and Latinos now and women and other folk come together, and labor and civil rights. But they root everything they did, just like in the first Reconstruction, with a moral framework. This is bigger than politics. This is about the heart and soul of the nation. And think about what we got in that period from 54 to 68. You get an opening up of Social Security in 1954. Because prior to that Social Security, people in the agrarian culture, farmers, could not receive Social Security because white senators from the South said to Roosevelt, we'll give you Social Security, but you've got to make sure that, number one, our women don't get it. Y'all didn't hear what I said. You got to make, these are the white men talking to Roosevelt. You got to make sure our women don't get it. So when Social Security was passed, 50% of white women couldn't get it because it didn't go to domestic workers. And you've got to make sure that that at that time our, not slave labor per se, but our, what do they call it when you're on the farm? Sharecroppers can't get it. But in 54, that's overturned. Then you get Head Start, Medicare, all rooted in a moral framing. You get federal funding for K through 12, Pell Grants for higher education. And all of these programs began to enjoy broad support because it's framed that it's the moral thing to do. You get the Civil Rights Act. Kennedy and Johnson both use moral language. You get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 after the march across the Edmunds-Pettus Bridge. And President Johnson on August 6, 1965 calls it a triumph for freedom as huge as any victory that has ever been won on the battlefield. Has ever been won. Fusion politics is gaining ground. But as it begins to gain ground, once again, the enemies of Reconstruction, touch your neighbor and say, the enemies, I'm going somewhere, of Reconstruction. Say too much is happening. The nation just might become not just a more perfect union, but might get closer to being a perfect union. We got to stop it. So Kevin Phillips, Nixon, President Nixon's Republican strategist, goes to him and says, I know how we can win. But the only way we can win, we've got to lock up the South. And we have to come up with something called the white Southern strategy. And we've got to learn how to play the race card and make working class white people vote against their own futures instead vote their fears in the South. And we've got to play this race card. But then Lee Atwater in 1980, before he died of tongue cancer, he was talking. And he was talking about this problem. I don't know if he knew the tape was on, but he just kind of, got loose lips. And he told how the whole strategy. Listen what he said. I wanted to use the real words, but for sake of the children, I won't. But he says, listen, he says, you start out, this is how you stop Reconstruction. This is how you stop America from going forward. He says, you start out in 1954 by doing like George Wallace. You say N. And you can get elected just saying N. He said, but by 1968, you can't say N anymore. It's not, it's not good. It's not acceptable. He said, it'll hurt you. It backfired. He said, so you come up. This is actually, you can Google this. He says, you come up with code language to talk about race without sounding like you're talking about race, like forced busing, like states' rights, like entitlement programs, like cutting taxes, like vouchers. He says, now everything you're talking about, it sounds economic, but the byproduct is that blacks get hurt worse than whites, but more importantly, you begin to sow in the hearts of Southern whites the fear that somebody's getting something they don't deserve, and you cause them to vote against their own self-interest. And the target of the white Southern strategy was all of the states in the old Confederacy, but also the suburbs of the North. And they knew that if they could divide, they could conquer. And it worked. Worked all the way so good that when Ronald Reagan got ready to run for office, he went down to Philadelphia, Mississippi. He didn't have to say one racist word. He went down to Philadelphia, Mississippi, used all of the code words, and he got elected by a landslide, even though his policies hurt the South more than any other president before him, in some ways. But then now, this moment we're in now, something strange is happening. You have a guy named Barack Obama run for presidency in 2008. And guess what he does? Now, it's not so much about him as a person. I want to work with this a little bit. He runs a campaign rooted in fusion politics, like you had in the 1860s, like you had in the 1960s. And he wins in places like North Carolina and has tremendous impact down here in the South, deep South. But look at the electorate that got him elected. It's deep, it's broad, it's young, it's old, it's LGBT, it's straight, it's black, it's Hispanic, it's Asian, it's Native American, it's white. It's a coalition, it's a fusion coming together like in the 1860s, like in the 1960s. And the electorate, say the electorate, that elects him represents the possibility of a third Reconstruction. Now, if you understand this, you understand why you see all this craziness happen. Because it just might work. It might work. Because the demographics now in Alabama and North Carolina are different. For instance, in North Carolina, we got 25% of the electorate is black. 3% is Latino. That's 28%. So you only need 12 to 13% of whites to vote their future, not their fear. And it's kind of like that here, right, Scott? Kind of like that here. So it might just work. It might just work. More black and brown people in the South now. White women are building coalition with black people. Young people are not as bound as they once were. But this new possibility, this possibility of a third Reconstruction, this new electorate scares the daylights. Well, let me just be real. Y'all forgive me. Scares the hell. That's what it scares. Yeah. Out of those who have a more homogeneous view of the world. It does not fit their worldview. And so what do you see? They're not waiting 22 years or 20 years, 20 and 30 years like they did to end the first Reconstruction. No. They're not waiting 14 years like they did to undermine the second Reconstruction. Right here in the embryonic stages of the possibility of a third Reconstruction, the extremists, the redeemers of our day, the deconstructionists of our day have said we're going to launch an all-out assault once again. And where do they start today? The same place they started in 1868 and in 1968, voting rights. Tax policy. Attacking public education. Attacking labor rights. And attacking the leaders of the progressive movement. And always trying to define anybody that's going forward as some kind of strange anomaly, un-American anomaly. You think about it. You remember what when the guy called President Obama a liar? He didn't call him a liar. See, most people say that. Go back and listen to that tape. He didn't call him a liar. He said, you are a lie. That's different. The language is different. You got to pay attention to this coded language. He did not say you're a liar. He did not say you're lying about the policy. He said, you are a lie. Which means you are not real. You are not American. You are not an anomaly. You're not supposed to be here. This is not the way it's supposed to be. It's a different way of saying something. And that's why this possibility, this embryonic stage of a third Reconstruction is why we are seeing so many of the tactics being used now. We are seeing an attempt to abort a third Reconstruction. We are seeing a preemptive strike on the third Reconstruction. Not an attempt to end it, but an attempt to stop it from coming to full term. And if those of us who believe in freedom understand where we are, we won't push up, push back, stop, because you're not being fought because you're weak. You're being fought because of the power that's in your hand to move this nation into a third. I hear Moses, God telling Moses, when Moses wanted to say, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, and God said, I ain't tell you to stand still. I told you to look at what's in your hand. Use what you got and move forward. Listen, when you have the Tea Party and the Koch brothers, those who are drunk on spiked tea and those who are sniffing K-O-C-H, sniffing Coke, y'all got that right. And when you see, especially in the South, what their agenda is, we are in a moral crisis. Not a democratic crisis, that's too small. Not a Republican crisis, not a liberal versus conservative crisis, because I don't even use liberal and conservative because it depends on whether I'm eating ketchup or hot sauce, whether I'm liberal or conservative. I don't like ketchup, so I'm conservative. I love hot sauce, so I'm liberal. My point is, you got to understand this moral crisis. We're in the middle of a time that's bigger than just electoral politics. It's about the soul of this nation. Because any time you are a politician, like the ones the Tea Party and the Koch brothers support, and you try to sell to the American people this agenda. Now, you know, I could, you know, talk about it as a, you know, I got my doctorate in public policy, and it could be use a bunch of words, but let's just break it down. Here's their agenda. Their agenda is this: if you want a great America, if you want a great Alabama, this is how you get there. Deny public education and attack teachers. Deny minimum wages, deny living wages, deny labor rights, deny health care, deny LGBT rights, women's health, immigrant rights, deny the president any help. As one person said, if the problems in America were kidney stones and they thought Obama had them, they wouldn't pass those either. Just deny. Touch your neighbor, say deny. And then deny justice through judges that roll back our rights like they did in the Shelby case. Use the lie about fraud to deny and suppress voting rights. Huh? Yeah. That's their whole agenda. And after you've done all of that denying, and after you criticize the president even for his suits, the way he salutes, his wife's hips, her shoulders, when she wants to give people, children, just get everybody mad. And once you've done all of that, the one thing you don't deny is the opportunity to get a gun quicker than you can get the right to vote. That's their whole agenda. And when anybody has the audacity to run on an agenda like that, we're in a moral crisis. Huh? Across our nation, these are tough times, driven by what's called the false worship of market morality. We've seen an implosion of our economy that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. You have people that want us to have pity on billionaires and inflict more pain on the poor. Did you hear that guy that ran for president, as vice president? What's his name? Paul who? Yeah, I knew that's his name. I wanted to know if you knew it. Say it. Yeah, Paul Ryan. I'm glad, you know, and he's suggesting that being poor is a vacation. You know, when you have that, and saying that if we really want to help the poor, let's destroy safety net programs. Because he says safety net programs make people lazy. And if we destroy safety net, that makes America a great nation. Never before in the history of America have we seen so much lewd, pornographic forms of money being used to resist the struggle for equality. We're in a moral crisis. We're in that place that Marvin Gaye used to say when he used to sing, make you want to holler. Huh? Yeah, make you want to holler. Trigger-happy policing. Bad breaks and setbacks. Corporations treated like people. People treated like things. Some of them, you know, I'm always interested in my so-called right-wing friends who want to talk so much about sexuality. And I don't know who called them right-wing. Again, I don't like using the language. I think we got to find better language. You know, right-wing, conservative, religious right. They're always worrying about somebody's sexuality. They always want to be up in somebody's bedroom. I think they have a fetish. But anyway, they always want to be. But I tell folk, the real sex, the real intercourse you ought to be worrying about is the illicit intercourse between the Supreme Court and big business that's producing the illegitimate children of injustice. That's the intercourse you ought to be. In fact, I know it's so because if you go read the book of Habakkuk, I believe it is, it talks about when the people have gone a-whoring after other gods. A political economist says, named Otto Schwammer, where Douglas and I were studying, says, we got a problem in American economic theory today. It's called consciousness. Our refusal to have a theory of economic that looks and sees that we're all integrated. That's a moral crisis. Anytime you have a professor at MIT talking about conscience, you know we have a moral crisis at MIT. And think about it, my friends, right now in America, at this evening, we are the richest nation on earth and the poorest. Think about that, at the same time. That's sin. I don't know what other word to describe it as. Our poverty numbers, especially child poverty numbers, are far higher than any other advanced Western democracy. And then we add to that the greatest gaps between the rich and the poor since we started collecting data 5 decades ago. Our income inequality is documented to be the highest in the advanced world. We've become the least economically mobile. So if you're born poor here in America, you're more apt to stay that way than in the other advanced countries. That's why I even with President Obama and some of the Democrats, when they say we're fighting for those who are striving to make their way into the middle class, some people are not striving to make their way into the middle class. They're just trying to live day by day. And the South is the native home of poverty. We have more poor people and more political leaders that are utterly untroubled by it. We have more poor people in the South, more poor people in Alabama than anywhere else. The 10 of the country's poorest 12 states are in the South. In the South. Though about 15% of Americans live in poverty, in Mississippi it's 23%, Louisiana 22%, Arkansas 20%, Georgia 19%, over 20% here in Alabama, South Carolina over 19%. And that's generally, that's not even disaggregating it when it comes to African American. We are in a moral crisis. Touch your neighbor and say, in a moral crisis. And the question is, are we going to push forward to this third Reconstruction? We're also in a nation without health care coverage. The only industrialized nation that doesn't give full health care coverage to all of its citizens. Think about it. 25% of the people in Texas without health care, 21% in Louisiana, 20% in Georgia, 19% in Mississippi, nearly 25% in North Carolina, in the 20s here in Alabama. And what are we seeing? Instead of trying to fix that problem, we are seeing a modern-day civil war over health care. There are 22 states that have expanded the Affordable Care Act, 24, and 22 that have decided not to. That's a civil war. And it's as old as when senators didn't want to expand, as I said, Social Security. And in the 24 states that have not expanded Medicaid, like Alabama, 6.7 million residents are projected to remain uninsured. Uninsured. That means right here in Alabama, you're going to lose $7 billion in reimbursement. 300,000 people being denied Medicaid expansion. And for every 400,000 people, 2,800 people die. So an estimate 2,000 people will die from January to December right here in Alabama. Not because God called them home, but because a governor would not allow Medicaid expansion. And I'm challenging every preacher, if somebody in your congregation dies from the lack of Medicaid expansion, don't you get up and preach that sermon about the Lord called them home. Don't put that on the Lord. I'm telling you, we need a movement of moral dissent now. Somebody must stand up and say it doesn't matter what party is in power. It doesn't matter who has the political supermajority. It doesn't matter if you got the votes. We're going to answer God's question, who will stand up for me against the workers of iniquity? There are some things that transcend political majorities. There are some things that are not liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican. There are some things that are just right versus wrong. We need a moral movement across this nation, an indigenously led, from the bottom up, homegrown, state-based, state government focused on these state capitals and governors, a deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative fusion movement. We need to make this third Reconstruction a reality. We need a movement that's about the moral fabric of our society. We need a moral movement with a southern drawl. Yeah. We need a moral movement with a southern context that understands what Scott Douglas taught us at MIT. If you want to change America, you got to think states. And specifically, you got to think southern states. And if you want to change America, you got to have a movement that's not scared to be anti-racist and anti-poverty. And when folk ask you, is it race or is it class, you should say it is. And if you want to change America, you've got to have white people willing to talk about racism and black people willing to talk about classism and all of us willing to talk about moving America forward. We need a moral movement rooted in our deepest faith values and our deepest tradition, a movement that doesn't mind sustain civil disobedience, that will fight in the courts, a transformative movement, a movement that's rooted in grassroots organizing, not just for one election campaign, but consistently. And we got to have a movement that takes on the hypocrisy of the so-called religious right. Something wrong in the South. You got more folk talking about they love Jesus in the South, and more of them voting for policies against the poor. Somebody's got to stand up and challenge that and say, don't you know that the Bible said, woe unto those who legislate evil, to rob the poor of their right? Don't you know what Matthew 23 says? Woe unto you, scribes and hypocrites, because you tithe the tenth of cumin, but leave undone the weightier matters of the law, which are love and justice and mercy. Don't you know what Matthew 25 says? Not to individual charity, because it's not talking about giving somebody a turkey once every Thanksgiving and saying you've helped the poor. Matthew 25 says he will say to the nations, in other words, to the system, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? When I was sick, did you give me health care? The fact of the matter is, I'm saying to all the religious right, you want a moral debate, bring it on, baby. Because now it's time for some real evangelicals to stand up. It's time for some folk that really know Jesus to stand up. And say, come on over here. You want to debate? You bring your agenda, your anti-homosexual, anti-abortion, anti-prayer agenda that you only have about 5 scriptures to support, and 4 of them you misinterpret. And not one of them trumps this scripture. You're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. Help me a little bit, Mike, man. Turn me up just a little bit. Ain't no scripture in the Bible about prayer in the schools, a lot about prayer in the home. Yeah. You can't talk about you anti-abortion and you let the child get here and then cut their food stamps and cut their health care when they get here and support war when they get here. You want to debate? Bring it on, baby. You bring your 5 scriptures and I'll bring my 2,000, because that's how many scriptures are in the Bible that deal with the issue of how you treat the poor, how you treat the women, how you treat children, how you treat the strangers, how you're supposed to engage in mercy. It's 2,000 scriptures. In fact, you can't even call yourself a conservative. Because if conservative means to hold on to the essence of, and you base your whole political ideology on 5 scriptures, and the Bible's got 2,000 scriptures that deal with love and justice and mercy, you're not a conservative, you're a liberal, because you're talking less about what God talks the most and talking more about what God talks about the least. Not only that, Scott, we need a movement that lifts higher our constitutional values. You know, we can't throw away, even that Constitution you got, as bad as the one is in 1901, they messed up in the beginning because they slip in there some stuff about Almighty God. You ought to hold them on that. They talk about inalienable rights. You ought to hold them on that. They even talk about equal protection, so you ought to hold them on that. And then there's that other Constitution, that federal Constitution, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. You know what that first principle is, right? Establish what? Justice. Ensure domestic tranquility. Provide for the common defense. And I've wondered why some of us stop fighting for welfare, since welfare is in the preamble of the Constitution. Welfare comes before freedom. Wish I was in class, I could teach a little bit. Welfare comes before freedom. In fact, in our Constitution, you know how politicians are, why are you against health care? I believe in freedom. Why are you for charter schools and vouchers going to private? Because I believe in freedom. You know, why do you support the president for war, but you won't support him for fair immigration policy? Because I believe in freedom. Well, actually, in our Constitution, freedom is impossible without justice, without domestic tranquility, without the common defense, and without promoting the general welfare. There is no concept of American freedom that is void of those things. And we need a movement that says when you keep millions of poor people from seeing a doctor, that's immoral and it's unconstitutional. When you kick hardworking people who lost their jobs through no fault of their own off unemployment, when you try to undermine public education and give tax dollars to private school owners, that's immoral, it's hypocritical, it's unconstitutional. When you go around singing America, America, God shed his grace on thee, but then you want to deny grace to the LGBT community and deny grace to immigrants and deny grace to women and deny grace to poor people, that is utter hypocrisy. And that brings me finally to the Forward Together moral movement in North Carolina, where we're trying to build a movement of moral dissent. And it's got to be state by state. You know, Dr. King told us on the March on Washington, he never told us to go back to D.C. Y'all ever read that speech? I don't know why we keep going back having commemorative marches. He never said do that. He didn't. Go read this. He said, I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, where it's governors whose lips are dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. That's what he said, right? And then he says, it's going to be difficult, but go back to Alabama. Go back to Mississippi. He never told us to get a bunch of buses and keep going up to D.C. He said, go back home and build a movement around your governor and your state capital, because if you change Alabama and we change North Carolina, we will change America. Nobody's going to come out of space or from D.C. or New York to save you. They don't even want to do the transfer on Southwest at Baltimore. They're not going to do it. So I didn't come down here to say, I came down here to share you a little bit of what we've learned in North Carolina and say, if you can do it here, you've got to do it here. Because the only pathway to higher ground is for an army to rise of Alabama that still believes in moral dissent that can break every yoke. Let me tell you, some folk told us we couldn't do anything. Our group, y'all have a supermajority here, right? Oh, Lord, when they got in office, everybody got depressed. Even some of the members of the Black Caucus saying, what are we supposed to do? I said, you're supposed to fight like you were put here to fight. You are the ancestors of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass didn't wait till he had a majority. He fought him when he was in the minority. People wanted to slow down. People wanted to be depressed. Well, we're just going to have to wait till the next election. But then somebody read, who will stand for me against the workers of iniquity? And we said that in every age, God always raises up dissenters. And dissenters help destroy the myths of delusion and domination. Like Walter Brueggemann says, prophetic moral vision always rises in the darkest moment to loose people from their despair and restore hope and imagination. Because hope has to come before implementation. People have to believe that they can make a difference. And so I'm glad today to be a part of this generation of moral dissenters. I'm glad to be called to fight now. I'm glad to be among those who give voice and spirit and body to the cause of justice, because it's our time. Fred Shuttleworth's not here now. Martin King is not here now. Rosa Parks is not here. But touch your neighbor and say, but their children are here. Yeah. And I'm glad it's our time. Anybody glad it's your time? Anybody glad the Lord woke you up this morning and started you on your way? Touch your neighbor and say, I'm here to fight right now. And what we need is an agenda. We need to change the argument. We don't want to talk about liberal versus Democrat. Well, we want to talk about policies that are constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible, historically inaccurate, and economically insane. And doesn't matter who's in office, that's our critique. And what we want is we want to see pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that create economic sustainability. We want educational equality, ensuring every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education. We want health care for all by ensuring access to the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and we want environmental protection. We want fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities as it relates to black, brown, and poor white people. And we want a society where we protect and expand voting rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, immigrant rights, and labor rights, and where we never give up on the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law. That's what we want. That's what we fight for. And I'm here to tell you, on with the moral perspective of our deepest constitutional values, our deepest religious values, whether it be from our Muslim friends or our Jewish friends, our Christian friends, our Baha'i friends. We've all come together in North Carolina. And I'm here to tell you with this agenda, after 7 years of organizing, even when Democrats were in office, because we didn't start just fighting. You got to fight even Democrats, because some of them drink some of that tea too. And in the back room, they sniffing that same Coke. Don't you be fooled. Like Thurgood Marshall said, a white snake, a black snake can bite you just like a white one. Don't be fooled. We've had to challenge legislators, black and white, even in our congressional delegates, because there must be a moral movement, a movement that's not just dependent on party, but looking at a deeper principle. And I'm telling you, on April, in rapid fire, I'm through, in about 50 days, Scott, our legislature went in rapid fire. It's like extremism on steroids. They denied 500,000 people Medicaid expansion. 900,000 people earned income tax, even though Ronald Reagan supported earned income tax. So when you can make Ronald Reagan look like a liberal, you're pretty extreme. They denied 170,000 people unemployment, raised taxes on 89% of the people in order to give 11% of tax break, took $1 billion from public education. We are now lower than Alabama in North Carolina in public education expenditure. And then on March the 5th, the 6th, the same time we were remembering Bloody Sunday, on Monday, Thursday, they rolled out the worst voter suppression bill even before the Shelby case as a precursor, thank you, to what they were going to do. And that's when on Monday, Thursday, a group of us got together and said, wait a minute, if they're going to crucify the sick, if they're going to crucify the poor, if they're going to crucify the elderly, if they're going to crucify teachers in public education, and now they're going to crucify voting rights, there's one thing that every crucifixion must have, and that's a witness. And we said if we don't do anything more, they're going to at least know there hath been a prophet among them. And we're going to remind them of what Paul said in Hebrews 10. We are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul, because faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And I want to tell y'all that on April 29th, in the middle of Pentecost, we decided it was time for a little Pentecostal revival right at the General Assembly. 17 of us went in, 7 preachers, 10 regular, just ordinary citizens, 2 young people, and 1 lady with cerebral palsy. We went into the General Assembly to sing, to hold our placards, to pray, and to speak loudly about the policies. They laughed when we came in. They said, ha ha. But then they saw me holding the hand of this white lady, and they said, wait a minute, we thought the NAACP was coming. What are all these white folk doing with them? Fusion politics. And after about an hour and a half, they decided to arrest us. And I wasn't so bothered when they arrested me, but when they arrested that woman with cerebral palsy, when they took her walker from her and put those zip ties around her, I said, uh-oh, because you know God can't stand it when you mess with the vulnerable. And so we didn't plan. Now, I want you to understand, we didn't plan another Moral Monday. We just said that we're going to have this first one. We didn't even have a name for it. But then the next Monday, 34 people showed up, and we didn't call them. Then the next Monday, the young lady over here, 49 people. Then the next Monday, 64. And then we named it. And by the end of the summer, 25,000 people had shown up at the General Assembly from 17. And 1,006 people got arrested, more people than ever in the history of the country at a state house. Now we've been at it 82 straight weeks, 150 events. They're not out of office. They're still in office. February, 80,000 to 100,000 people showed up for a mass moral march on Raleigh, our state capital, in North Carolina. And then after, from April to February, things started turning. God started moving. First thing that happened is the courts overruled their decision to give public money to private schools, and we won. Then the judge that tried all of our cases threw out 960 of them and said they should have never been arrested in the first place. Then a 3-panel judge in the federal appeal court ruled in favor of our case against voter suppression and said it was a violation of Section 2. Then 37 young people said we want to not just remember Freedom Summer, we want to emulate it. And so they decided to have Moral Freedom Summer 50 years later. And they went into 47 counties. And in 3 weeks, they knocked on 17,000 doors or called people or encouraging them to register to vote or either educate them. And now, in the state where it was depressed, voter registration is up like never before. Now, the political pundits say, well, we've never seen an off-year election like this. On this coming Monday, and there's supposed to be one here in Alabama. I hope you all are joining. We're having a funeral procession with caskets taking them to the General Assembly and to the governor's office because of the denial of Medicaid and all of the people who are dying and the economic security that's being lost. When we started, ma'am, every issue that we are supporting now was under 50%. But after 82 straight weeks of moral conscious building, every issue we support is now over 50% in the poll. When we started, the governor was at 50% bragging. Now he's at 30% and falling. When we started, the legislature was at 40%. Now they're at 17% in the polls and falling. This summer, a Republican mayor broke ranks when his hospital was closed and joined the movement and came out against the Republican governor and the establishment that had blocked Medicaid expansion. And then that Republican mayor, who is a real conservative, walked 273 miles to Washington, D.C. with a civil rights activist named Bob Zellner to dramatize how ugly it is for the Republican-led or the Tea Party-led General Assembly to deny Medicaid expansion. And if y'all don't believe that all of that, let me tell you what happened in Mitchell County. If you say, well, they did that in North Carolina. No, we did it in Mitchell County. Mitchell County in North Carolina is way out in the west. It's 89% Republican, 99% white. And after 12, 13 weeks of Moral Monday at the General Assembly, I got a message. They want you to come to Mitchell County. Will you come? My answer, hell no. That was my answer. I'm sorry if some of you preachers can't handle that, but I'm a real preacher. I said I'm not going to Mitchell County because they ran all the black people out in 1920. First of all. Number two, I used to be the human relations director, and I know out where all the paramilitary groups are. Number three, there's only one road up the mountain in the Mitchell County and one road down. I ain't going up there tomorrow, Monday, or not. But then Vernon Tyson, who's one of the 80-some-year-old white United Methodist ministers, and another brother got a hold of me and said, Barber, you got to go. Because this message about going higher can cut across the normal divisions. So I decided to go. That morning, I kissed my wife about 10 minutes. Some of y'all didn't laugh. If you ain't never had a 10-minute kiss, that's your problem. You ought to try it sometime. I preached that morning like I was going to never come back, because in the black church, see, they put a little black shawl over the preacher's chair when you die. And if they don't leave it up there but 1 week, it means they were glad to see you gone. And I preached to make sure I at least get a month. Got in the car, got 2 singers to go with me, hoping they could sing. Got my security guard. Now, you got interested. My security guard has a gun with 1 bullet. It's rusty. It might not kill you, but it'll give you gangrene. Anyway, went on up the mountain. Scotty got there about 6 o'clock. About dusk dark, I got out of the car. 300 people in this church, most of them Republican, all white. They said, now let me tell you something, Mr. Reverend Barber, we didn't bring you up here to talk politics. I didn't come to talk politics like you're talking about. I come to talk about what's right and wrong. They said, good. They said, do you know the scripture when Jesus overthrew the tables in the temple? I said, yeah, that was the first moral Monday. Because that happened on Monday of Holy Week. They said, do you know the song, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds Our Hearts in Christian Love? I've been singing it all my life. They sung that song, and then Vernon Tyson introduced me, and I said, I might as well go for it. And kind of like here tonight, I went into this thing. I talked about how the cutting unemployment was hurting those mountain people, and how Medicaid was causing mountain people to die, and how cutting public education was undermining their children, and how fracking and different things that were hurting the water tables was killing them in the mountain area. And I went right down to I talked about how the tax policies weren't fair. I reminded them that when the Voting Rights Act was passed, white women could not even sit on juries. And in the midst of that crowd, they didn't holler or say anything, but I saw some tears. And then at the end, they said, Reverend Barber, let me tell you why we invited you. They said, we've been coming tomorrow Monday clandestine. We've been driving down every Monday because we've been looking for something that was bigger than party. We wanted to make sure you weren't just an arm of the Republican Party. And we noticed, Democrat Party, we noticed you don't even allow politicians on the stage. I said, that's right. This is a people's movement. It's a movement for people impacted. It's a movement for moral leaders and clergy and advocates. They said, well, we want to tell you why we had you come up here. We want to join the movement. I said, what you say? They said, we want to join the movement. They said, now, we got a question for you. Can we form a chapter of the NAACP? Now, y'all got to understand, on my daddy's side, I'm Christian Church Disciples of Christ, but on my mama's side, I'm Pentecostal. So I stepped back, and under my breath, I said, Shakadadabosoka. Because I said, that ain't nothing. And they said, now, it's going to be predominantly white. It's going to probably be the most diverse branch in the NAACP. They said, but we will fight. And now, in Mitchell County, where we never thought about having an NAACP, in less than 4 months, they have 200 members and one of the most radical branches of the NAACP in this country. It looks like the NAACP in 1909. And from that one branch, we now have 7 branches of the NAACP that are all predominantly white in areas where we never had them before. Then they said, then the guy said, you see that man sitting right there? I said, yeah. They said, that's the former chairman of the Republican Party. I said, what do you mean by former chair? They said he resigned because he's not in line with the Tea Party. He's an Eisenhower Republican, a Teddy Roosevelt Republican, and he resigned. And anytime you need him to speak on the stage at tomorrow Monday as a Republican, he'll come talk as a Republican about why that we really don't have Republicans in our General Assembly. We have extremists who have hijacked the Republican Party and are trying to walk under the guise of Republican. Because if they were real Republicans, they'd be like their founder, Abraham Lincoln, who cared about voting rights. And then they said about 9:45, we got one more request, Reverend Bob. I said, what is that? They said, we want you to lead us on a march. I said, when? They said, tonight. I said, tonight where? They said, to the Tea Party legislator's house, because we want to let him know that we send him up there and we can bring him home. And I said, well, all that's well and good, but let's slow down a minute, white people. I said, just slow down. Y'all just getting in. I know y'all excited and everything up here in Mitchell County. Well, by then, I wasn't scared anymore. I said, let me tell you something, white people. Black folk don't march at night. Y'all just got to be quiet. We didn't start that. We didn't start that. I said, now, I might be light-skinned, but if I go over there, he going to see my eyes. and he's going to shoot me. I said, but if you will come tomorrow in Asheville in the daytime, I said, we got a march in the daytime, or if you call a daytime, I'll come back. And the next day in Asheville, in a city that's less than 3% black, 10,000 people showed up with the NAACP banner in the front. I'm telling you, if we begin to go to higher ground and raise the moral issues, this country is waiting. There are people that are hungry for a moral agenda, like we saw in the first Reconstruction, like we saw in the second Reconstruction. And you're the only one that can do it. It's our time to restore hope and imagination. It's our time to resist the low road. It's our time to move from the hypocrisy of the low valleys and move to the higher ground. My son is an environmental physicist. And he told me one day, he said, Daddy, if you ever get lost out in the mountainous territory, he said, you got to learn to do something. I said, well, he said, don't walk out at the base of the mountain. As easy as it might seem, he said, because snakes live in the lowlands. My son said, Daddy, I know it'll be a little hard. He said, but if you want to come out alive, first climb up the mountain until you get to that place. It's called the snake line. It's above the snake line. And he said, if you get above the snake line, snakes can't live at high altitude. I wish I had a witness here. Because snakes die at high altitude because they're cold-blooded. And he said, it might be hard, but make your way to higher ground. If you get to higher ground, you can get above the snake line. And if you get above the snake line, you can come out. And I stopped by to tell you all at this banquet, there's some snakes out here. They're crawling around mighty low. Voter suppression is below the snake line. Alabama holding on to a fraudulent constitution is below the snake line. Denying Medicaid is below the snake line. Hurting people when they're down is below the snake line. But we've got to take this nation above the snake line. And I know a place above the snake line. It sounds like this: one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That's above the snake line. Tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, it's time for America to climb. It's time for Alabama to climb. And I want to know, is there anybody here that still believes in higher ground? Is there anybody here that still believes in higher ground? It might not be easy, but it's time to climb together and go to higher ground. It's time to march together and mobilize together and organize together and pray together and speak truth to power together and protest together and go to court together and go to jail together and stand up together and vote like never before together. It's time to take this nation to higher ground. No matter who's in the governor's office, somebody shout higher ground. No matter who's in the Congress, somebody shout higher ground. No matter what the Tea Party says, somebody shout higher ground. Shout higher ground. Tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, they don't have enough political power to keep me in the valley. Tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, they don't have enough money to buy me off. It's time to go to higher ground. Say higher ground, where every child is educated. Higher ground, where the sick have health care. Higher ground, where our voting rights are protected. Is there anybody here that still believes in higher ground? Tell your neighbor, say, neighbor, too many tears have been cried. Too many people have sacrificed, died, and bled for us to settle for anything less than higher ground. We cannot allow America, allow Alabama to wallow in this valley of injustice. Our politics can be moral. They can be fair. They can be kind. They can be loving. We can follow the ethic of love. We can beat the swords of racism into the plows that will till the new soil of brotherhood and sisterhood. We can heal our sick. We can protect our environment. We can change the injustices in our judicial system. But somebody must answer the question, who will go for me? And I stopped by to tell you, I'm on my way to higher ground. Is there anybody going? Will you declare this land is my land and this land is your land? And we refuse to live low down. And I just want to close right here, because I get tired sometimes of people talking about how hard it is. If our foreparents could take this nation from the snake-like lowlands of slavery to higher ground, don't tell me we can't beat a Tea Party. Y'all hear what I'm saying? If they could make it through Jim Crow to higher ground, if they could make it through bombs and killing and hanging, then surely we can make it to higher ground. And I heard, is that a preacher right there? I heard that if you just try to go to higher ground, there's help from another quarter. There's help from another sphere. I heard that if we help the poor and stop exploitation, the light of God will shine on us, and we'll be called repairers of the breach. I heard that if we try to do what the Lord says, and if we wait on the Lord by serving the Lord, we shall run and not get weary. We shall walk and not faint. We shall mount up on wings as eagle and not get weary. I heard that if God be for us, it doesn't matter if the whole world is against us. I heard that the Lord is my light and my salvation. I heard weeping may endure for a night. Mean politicians may endure for a night. Tea parties may endure for a night. Super majorities may endure for a night. Governors may endure for a night. But if you hang in there, joy still comes in the morning. I heard that you might get crucified on Friday, but if you hang in there, early Sunday morning, resurrection comes. And that's why we ought to be singing right now. Lord, lift us up and let us stand. A higher plane that I have found. Lord, plant our feet on higher ground. That's our cry. That's what I came to preach about. Lord, plant Alabama on higher ground. Lord, plant North Carolina on higher ground. Lord, plant America on higher ground. Lord, lift us up and let us stand and plant our feet on higher ground. It's our time to take this nation to higher ground. Who will stand for me against the workers?